how did we get to this point where it used to be that the populists themselves, the people who felt like they weren't being represented by the two-party system, embraced the term, embraced the idea. And now it seems that there are a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle, the ideological aisle, who are not being served by the small sliver at the top, by the 1%. And yet still, those people who identify as Democrats revile the term populism, and the idea of a mass movement is perceived to be kind of inherently toxic and racist. And anyone who tries to argue, hey, let's do a big Bernie-style multiracial working class movement, the subtext of populist, the subtext of a movement of any kind like that is that it must be racist. And you have a lot of the intelligentsia, diverse intelligentsia, a lot of including Black journalists and journalists of color and queer journalists, et cetera, being very kind of knee-jerk antagonistic at the even idea of having a populist movement that isn't reactionary.
A mass movement of working class people.
Yeah.
That is, Brianna, that is the question of our time. There's no way I'm going to be able to answer that.
Don't ask me. I don't live in the present. I just have history.
Well, I can give you. Well, that's what I was about to say. Watch how I squirm out of this one, Mr. Virgil, Texas.
I know all the tricks.
Brianna, let's go. I bring you now to the 1950s when the. No, seriously, because that's where the answer to your question begins. I mean, but you've put your finger on exactly what makes me so angry about the present day, is that we don't understand that the power of the left resides in mass movements of working class people. That's what it is. It's not science. It's mass movements of working class people. That's the way change gets made. That's the way all the sort of great movements and the great moments in our history, I should say, that's how they came about. How did we lose sight of that? Well, it's a great question. And I tried to explain it, and the people know. And it begins, I mean, the answer is really long, but for our sakes, let's start in the 1950s. Have you guys ever heard of the historian Richard Hofstadter?
Yes.
I have.
So he was a leader of a school of historians in the 50s they called them, well, I don't know if they called themselves this, but they were called as consensus historians, consensus thinkers. And their great idea, this is after World War II, the labor movement has sort of settled into, it's become more conservative, the depression is over, the war is over. And you have this generation of historians coming up, and one of their claims is that basically dissent is a form of dysfunction. Dissent, and America has never been really a country about dissent. In America, the leaders have always agreed on the same basic things. This is the guiding idea of what they call the consensus school of historians. And Richard Hofstadter decides to write a full-blown sort of reconsideration of reform movements in American history. And he starts with populism. And he hates populism. He denounces it in basically all his books. But in his big book about reform, this is the one where he really does it. The first chapter is all about populism, and basically he says populism was not really what everybody has been telling you it is. It's not really this reform movement that gave birth to the ideas that later became the New Deal. No, populism was a movement of backward-looking people who were paranoid. They were in the grip of mental illness. They were cranks. They were anti-intellectual, and they were anti-Semitic as well. And so he basically took that stereotype from the newspapers of the 1890s without attribution, without ever mentioning that the newspapers of the 1890s said this, and made this into his sort of grand theory of what populism was. That this was a movement of hayseeds and cranks and backward-looking people who were in the grip of conspiracy theories and who didn't understand modern economics. And then he threw in the anti-Semitism stuff as a kind of a bonus. And this book was a huge bestseller. It was he got the Pulitzer Prize. It's been described as the most influential work of American history ever written. I have a first edition of it in the other room. I don't think I have it right here. And anyhow, this became basically overnight became accepted wisdom among a certain kind of consensus academics. So sociologists, people in all these different academic fields accepted the idea that and then there's the other thing Hofstadter did. He said that he started using populism with a lowercase p. And he said, we see other populist movements. Populism is now a generic name for when you have mass movements of racist, paranoid, anti-intellectual, backward-looking people. And he made it into a generic term for that. And it instantly became, in widespread use. What he was trying to get at was McCarthyism. He was trying to invent a theory for explaining McCarthyism. And his fellow social scientists who really felt that they were the victims of McCarthyism immediately accepted this and embraced it and started writing books about it. Edward Shills, famous sociologist at the University of Chicago, starts writing about it. They start using the word populism as a generic term to describe these anti-intellectual, cranky, paranoid, racist movements. Okay, now here's where the story gets interesting. Other historians, within about 5 or 6 years, other historians have completely refuted Hofstadter's view of populism. They write all these books saying, no, you're wrong. They weren't particularly anti-Semitic. No, you're wrong. They weren't anti-intellectual. No, you're wrong. And they destroy the Hofstadter thesis. This is, did I tell you guys I used to be a graduate student in history? I even got a PhD in history a long time ago.
We know that, Doctor.
Yeah, that's right. Get my title correct. So the Hofstadter thesis about populism is one of the most discredited sort of what would you call it, theories in American history. It's like the frontier thesis, or all these other sort of discarded theories. But nobody ever told political science that, right? And they embraced this, and they keep using it to this day. And so you've got this whole, all the intellectuals that you were talking about, Brianna, who use this term because it's based on this book written in 1955, and they don't know that the book was refuted.
Well, do you think
wait, but it gets better. I'm not done yet. It goes on and on. We're talking about, this is right now, this entire pedagogy, they call it global populism studies, is based on a famous mistake by Richard Hofstadter in the 1950s. They don't know that he was refuted. They just are like, oh, there's this great word populism. So you're like, well, why is that? How can academia, which is so dedicated to, seeking out the truth and doing the research and blah, 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 how can this persist? How can a wrongful interpretation from 60 years ago still be going strong? And the answer is because it's a very useful wrong interpretation. It's a wrong interpretation that is nevertheless extremely flattering to academics,
right,
and to the professional class generally. And here's why. So Hofstadter's book, remember, it's called The Age of Reform. And the idea is you've got a wrong idea of reform, populism, and then you've got a right idea of reform. And the wrong idea of reform says you got to have a mass movement of working class people. You got to have the Farmers Alliance. You got to have the CIO. You've got to have these giant movements of working class people to enact change, to get to get reform, right? That's the wrong idea, according to Hofstadter. What's the right idea? Come on, this is 1955. You know what it is. It's managerialism. It's you've got to have guys with PhDs. You've got to have guys like Richard Hofstadter and his friends. You've got to have them sitting in Washington, sitting around the big mahogany table, lobbyists from the Farm Bureau, lobbyists from whatever, lobbyists from the American Medical Association, and they'll sit around that table, from Big Pharma or whatever, and they'll sit around that table and they'll hammer out the answer, and that way you'll get reform. So there's two models. There's the model that you and I know from studying history gets results. And there's this other model where you just have educated people figuring it out for you. In Washington, D.C., this is the Obama model. This is what, Obamacare, this is where that comes from. And basically, that's liberalism today. They have never looked back. Why? Because it's extremely flattering to them, to the professional elite.
Well, it's also protective of the financial interests that now are at the root of both parties, right? If mass movements are tricky because they're more difficult to control and they're more diffuse and they can't be, So there seems to be, the Republicans have dabbled in kind of some populist lingo, and there is concern that people like Tucker Carlson are moving in that direction and see the obvious appeal of it, the Steve Bannons of the world.
Yep.
But there doesn't seem, as you pointed out, when Trump came time for Trump to actually legislate, he didn't break from tradition. His main accomplishments are an enormous upward circulation of wealth through this tax.
Yeah, it's just Reaganism all over again. Yeah.
Yeah.
And but it's in a deeper way as well, which is that if change is going to be made by the leaders of the professions, and if you only want, remember how earlier I compared like Obama's cabinet with all the prize winners and all the geniuses, and the president of Harvard University, Larry Summers, the elite of the elite, right? That's who's making the choices, and that's who's crafting the reforms, versus the Roosevelt model, where you have the CIO, you have the labor movement in the streets, and you have these people drawn from all of these different places who are making reforms. Two completely different models. Well, if your model is the Obama one, where it's only made by the people who are the foundation darlings and the endowed chairs and the whatever the hell it is, the genius grant winners, there's a word for what you're going to get, and that word is orthodoxy. And so, no, they're not going to challenge the Wall Street banks. Of course not. And it's not even because they're being, because they go through the revolving door, although they go through the revolving door and then are paid by the Wall Street banks. It's because they really believe in this stuff. They believe in neoclassical economics. They believe in whatever the orthodoxy is.